Hello and welcome to Goldster Inside Story, where I am in a rainy, overcast London and my guest is in the American state of Nebraska, where my iPhone tells me the temperature is -3, which is something else in the American language of Fahrenheit, but we've checked it is below freezing and it's 6 o'clock in the morning. So thank you for being here. My guest lives on a working farm, and I hope they get up early there too. And I'm told the deer hunting season has just begun. What a treat we have in store, because my guest has been, or still is, a beauty queen, a ballerina, a pianist. And because this is a book show, this is why she is here. She is the award-winning New York Times best-selling author of 11 novels, of which her latest is A Single Light, which I've got here, and part of a series and a sequel to the much acclaimed The Line Between. Their links are in the chat. They are a fantastic series, and we're going to learn about creating a dystopian world, but one which reflects very much what's in our own news headlines: climate warming, melting permafrost, pandemics, the creation of cult followings, and the skill that you need to wrap all those into a compelling, we're going to work out a compelling what, because the BBC's mantra, that's my old organization, is to inform, educate, and entertain. What is the mantra of a thriller writer with something to say of our modern world? We will ask. We also have a competition. You can't speak yet, my dear guest. We also have a competition of questions of sorts, because this is Goldster, and for those of a literary bent. As you see, our elegant and patient guest, take a guess at what is the best and worst piece of writing advice she has ever received. Put it in the chat. What is the best and worst piece of writing advice she has ever received? And then we can talk about writing advices. The second quiz question is, how did she get her name? And what is that name? Without further ado, let us welcome Tosca Lee to Goldster Inside Story.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Are you awake, Tosca, or do you do this in your sleep? It's very early there.
As far as I know, I'm awake and have the coffee going. So
you've got the coffee at 6 in the morning. Now you are in. You're not in any plush apartment in New York or Hollywood or anything. You are in the middle of Nebraska, which is the middle of sort of America that we see on the westerns. Describe the farm to me. Describe the landscape.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say I was a city girl, a single city girl who married a farmer and single father of 4. So that's how I came to be on the farm. And so it's been a learning curve for me to learn how to be a farm wife and mother. So in the middle, I'm right in the middle of the United States. I've grown up most of my life in Nebraska. And as you mentioned, I've represented Nebraska before on the pageant stage. So here, my husband and his family farm 4,000 acres, corn and soybeans, which is the main crop here. Nebraska is known for its corn, its fields, its agriculture, and its beef. So here I'm surrounded by fields. It is bitterly cold outside, and harvest has recently finished. And so it is, as you mentioned, deer season now.
So the landscape is flat and agricultural, is it? Mainly.
Very, very much flat on this eastern side of the state where I live. I'm just south of Fremont, which is not far from the capital. If you go west, though, then you get into the beautiful sand hills and the scenic Chimney Rock area where the early settlers of the Oregon Trail passed through. So,
okay, so this is Western land, is it? Clint Eastwood territory?
Yes, this would be considered Clint Eastwood territory from here up to, through Iowa, where the bridges of Madison County are, and then up into Montana. If you watch Yellowstone, you've seen some of that. And then to the west of us is Colorado, which is where we go to ski.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I love this. And I presume, but I'll ask you in a minute, that you get the atmosphere, the idea of some of your books from this landscape, but you didn't originally grow up intending to be a best-selling writer on the New York Times list, did you? Were you going to be a ballerina? Is that right?
That's true. I wanted to be a ballerina from a young age. I wrote from a young age. I just never considered writing to be a thing that I wanted to pursue, even though I had won some contests and things like that. But I desperately wanted to be a ballerina. I spent my summers leaving Nebraska to go out to New York or different places to dance. And I pursued it ardently. And that was my whole goal in life as a young person. And by young person, I mean as a teenager. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, I had an injury. I ripped a groin, and it set me back almost a year. And ballet is very competitive. It's a lot like gymnastics in that way. You need to be very accomplished at a very young age. And there's always somebody better and stronger and younger willing to come in and take your place. So around that time, it became a question of reassessing what I might want to do with my life. And so I went off to college instead.
Okay, so how old would you have been then? What's 17, 18 or something?
I was 14, 15 when I injured myself. And so it was quite early. And that was probably the height of my career. I was dancing with ballet companies at that time, balancing that with school. And I continued to dance up until I was 18, but I knew at that point it would not be at the same level that I wanted. I continued to dance through college too. So, yeah.
One thing about a great fictional hero character is how they overcome obstacles, of course. How did that hit you as a teenager?
That was, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I mean, how did you overcome that, as it were, and do what you're doing now?
I think, ballet is especially a great training ground for writing later in life and a lot of other careers, because it teaches you tenacity, because you never stop trying. You're never quite there. The bar is always higher. And so when that happened, initially I thought, well, I'll just have to rehabilitate this and, continue to put the time in to working past it. But some things, it set me back about a year, I want to say. So,
were you an avid reader at the time?
I was always an avid reader. So I was the child in school and in high school too, who almost flunked math because I was reading novels during math class. So I've never been great at math, whether it was because I was reading or I just was never good at it, I'm not quite sure, but always an avid reader. And I was also the one who used to read beneath my covers with a flashlight, or later on I learned that my digital clock gave just enough of a glow that I could read 1 or 2 lines at a time. And today my eyes are terrible. I have no idea if that has anything to do with it, but always an avid reader.
And that Emma asked, can I repeat the 2 questions that were asked? Yes, we have some quiz questions going through. And as you listen to Tosca and hear her, what is the best and worst piece of writing advice she has ever received? Take a guess. There's no right answer because she might not have even worked it out herself, but I thought I'd throw it into the mix. And the second question does have a specific answer that we're going to find out at the end, is how did Tosca Lee get her name? The Tosca bit, not necessarily the Lee bit, although the Lee bit might be a clue. Who knows? You can Google it if you want, but why not just take a stab at it? There you are, Emma. Good to see you back with us again. I just wanted to ask, when you were going through this adjustment, as it were, what authors were you reading? Who would you say influenced you?
There was an author I loved, Marion Zimmer Bradley, wrote a book called The Mists of Avalon, which not only created my love for all things King Arthur, and made me go on my pilgrimage basically to Wales and throughout the UK and Glastonbury Abbey in my teenage years. But also I read Jean Auel's Clan of the Cave Bear. I really loved sweeping historical novels. The Mists of Avalon was over 800 pages. It was a tome. So yeah, it's a large book. And Clan of the Cave Bear is several books in the series, which has spanned several decades, as the author has produced them with years in between sometimes.
That's now, but in this time, or sometime in this period, you became a beauty queen. And I've got down here, correct me if I'm wrong, you became Mrs. Nebraska America and Mrs. Nebraska United States. Are they two different things, or am I getting my information mixed up?
Those are two different things. So in the beauty pageant world, there are different pageant systems. So here in the States, for the unmarried women, we have Miss America, which is a scholarship pageant. We have Miss USA, which is more geared towards models, that kind of thing. I had no pageant history growing up. This is never something I did ever before, but in the 90s, somebody had suggested to me, why don't you try to run for Mrs. Nebraska, which is a married women's pageant. And I was in my first marriage at that time. And so when it was suggested to me, having never done this at all, I said, okay, I'll try anything once. Why not?
And so when you do, because we've all seen, are you in a bathing suit with a sort of rod or something? How does it work? Can you demonstrate to us what you do?
Yeah, no, luckily in the married pageant, there's no talent segment. So half of the judging is based on interview. And then of course you still have the swimsuit and evening gown competition. I never appeared in a swimsuit beyond the initial pageant and the national pageant. I did have a couple evening gown events, but I call it a very strange means to a very good end. The very good end, meaning that I got to help raise awareness for many charities around my state. I got to represent different great causes around the state. So I spent an entire year doing that, and it was just wonderful.
Oh, that's pretty. You don't do it anymore. That's finished, is it? That's not.
No. After doing the America system, I remember thinking, oh, I kind of understand now how this works. But it was all over. I had done the national pageant. I had gone home and fulfilled a year of all these appearances. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try it one more time. So I did do the United States system, and I was first runner-up in the national pageant. And I thought, okay, I've tried this. I've done it. This was great. Time to move on.
Okay, so that's good. So you said, as far as Miss World and Miss Universe goes, that's done. I've been there and done that. Don't need to get that.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah. Time to write some books, do some other things.
Now, getting back to your books, I have two things, and I'm not sure how the chronology of this works with your pageantry and everything. But the first book you wrote, which remains unpublished,
Yes.
was not in Nebraska and those heartlands we were talking about before. It was here about Stonehenge.
Yes.
How on earth did that ever happen?
Well, I was always interested in Stonehenge. I've always been interested in these ancient monuments. Having seen it first in my teenage years, I was always fascinated. And this was 1989, and I had gone off to college. And I went to school in Massachusetts. I went to Smith College. I came home to Nebraska. I'm the only person I know who comes home to Nebraska for spring break. Most people go to Florida, somewhere warm, tropical, whatever. I came home to Nebraska, and I was talking with my dad about how great books, great stories, great novels are like roller coasters with their loops and twists and turns. And I blurted out that day to my dad and said, I think I'd like to write a book. And the idea was maybe I could write a book for someone else to experience that roller coaster. And my father, who's a long time, my father has been a professor my entire life of business, not English or anything like that. He said, all right, Tosca, I'll make you a deal. I'll pay you what you would have made this summer working at the bank, which I was supposed to do for a second summer in a row as a bank teller. If you will write your first novel, do it full time and treat it like a job. And this was a terrific deal I could not pass up. And I said, of course, I would love to do that. I totally forgot that my father had signed me up to go to Oxford for the first part of the summer and study economics, which is more numbers and more things I'm not good at. But while I was there, this is 1989, I was able to buy and acquire a bunch of history books about Stonehenge, Salisbury Plain. So I came home with an entire suitcase full of research materials. And yeah, so that is how that happened.
And you were walking around and around Stonehenge. Of course, there is and we're going to talk about it in a minute. There is a cult element there, isn't there? The Druids, not a cult, but an organization of people that believe a certain thing there, and look a bit strange on our television screens every solstice. We've had a couple of answers. Now we're not going to tell them the answer, but Christine says Tosca's name comes out of Puccini's opera, and Emma, Tosca comes from Puccini's name because her parents loved opera. This is the parents, and let's go. Your father was a professor, and he gave you this first element here. So that's what we know so far. You will get a full story of that at the end. You went from there to 6 years, I don't know if it was straight from there, 6 years of rejections on your first book that did get published. What were you doing on those 6 years, and how did that whole journey, as they call it, feel?
Yeah, so that first novel, I wrote it that summer in 1989. I tried to get that one published. I sent it off to a New York literary agent. I made all the mistakes. I did it all wrong. I not long ago found that initial rejection letter. And this is from Writer's House, which is a premier literary agency in New York City to this day. And they said in this letter, the poor soul who had to read my book said, your plot lacks tension, your characters are two-dimensional, but, and this was the kicker, but it is strangely reminiscent of Clan of the Cave Bear, which was one of my favorite novels growing up that I mentioned before. So that was the minuscule little piece of encouragement I needed to keep going. And so through the 90s, I worked on another book that I never quite finished. And in the late 90s, I got the inspiration for what would become my first novel, wrote it very quickly in 6 weeks, thought that this was fate, started sending it out, and spent 6 years, as you mentioned, Humphrey, getting systematically rejected over and over again. And during that time, I was also working on some other ideas. I also worked for the Gallup organization as a global consultant. Somebody said you'd be a great consultant, and I said, okay, I'll go give it a try. And that's what I did. For 8 years, I traveled the world teaching and interacting with various global and Fortune 500 companies.
And that was your day job, and
yes.
And during the night, or whenever the post or the emails came in, you got
yes.
these letters in. And when they came in, how did you ever think, I'm going to give up, or did you say, well, I'll send it to another agency or another agency?
Yeah, I remember I was in Thailand. I was gone on a long stint for work. And I was in Thailand, and we had sent them, meaning my agent, who I had finally acquired.
From Writer's House or from somewhere else?
From somewhere else. Yeah, no, Writer's House. I've been scared to approach them ever since. But no, I finally did get an agent. I think I wore her down. I just wrote to her a lot, and she finally took me on. And we had sent the manuscript off to the latest publisher, and I had high hopes. And I remember being in Thailand and getting the email and just thinking, I don't know how long I can keep doing this, because at this point it's what, 2005 or 2006, right? So over, a decade and a half has gone by.
Yeah. And
yet the book was done, and I really wanted to not have had all that be in vain. So kept trying.
You kept trying. So as we do, the other question that we've got, as we're looking for more questions as to how Tosca came about her name, we have 2 answers so far. And also, if anybody wants to know about writing tips, has any writing tips for Tosca, or guesses what is the best and worst she's received, put it in, because we're having a sort of writing masterclass here as well as everything else. But when you got finally published and on the sort of, your website and everything,
Finally.
finally published.
Finally.
Just before I move on from that, when you get finally published, is it sort of helicopter trips to champagne parties, or what happens in that process?
Oh, it's different. It's changing all the time, but no, not helicopter trips to champagne parties. There were days early on in my career when, we did more book tours, which are starting to make a comeback after the pandemic, but is done a lot less these days. There's a lot more virtual tours, but there were a few years of tours and getting picked up in the limo and things like that. But it's also a lot of work. It's a lot of, as I say, hustling. You have to go out and you have to do your part to market the book. It's not like it would have been before the age of the internet and different things like that, when you just sent your manuscript off in your mailbox and you got your adoring fan mail forwarded to you from your publisher. So lots of library trips, lots of speaking events, lots of reader events, lots of book clubs, different things like that. Fortunately, I happen to love those things. So that's the fun part of the job for me.
And then when you hit the New York Times bestsellers list, which is the envy of every writer, how did the news come to you? What did you feel there?
I was on a plane about to take off, and a friend of mine had apparently been looking out to see if it was going to show up on the list that week. And she sent me an email. And is when you're flying, they make you turn your phones off right before you leave. So she sent me this right as I was about to take off, and I saw it and I couldn't text or call or anything with anyone. So I thanked her, turned my phone off, and I turned to the lady sitting next to me on the plane. I said, when we get into the air, I'm going to have a glass of wine because I've just made the New York Times bestseller list. Would you like a glass too?
Oh, wonderful.
That's how it happened.
So it's a sort of stamp of recognition, isn't it? To actually, as you said that. So congratulations from us all on that, although that was some years ago. But now I'm going to, I don't usually do this, but I would like you to read a little section from your latest book, which is A Single Light. And before you do that, the sort of marketing descriptions that you've got on your website and everything is that Tosca Lee has made a name as what is known as speculative fiction. Often her books are religiously themed, controversial, and praised for their lyrical prose, extensive research, and vivid imagery. When I was reading A Single Light, I completely backed that up. So give us a small section of that, Tosca.
All right. Well,
and could you set the context for us of
absolutely
who's there and what's happened? Yes,
absolutely. So A Single Light is book 2 in the Line Between duology. The Line Between is both of these books came out in 2019, and they happen to be a pandemic duology. So the last few years have been a little bit weird, especially after these books came out for me. So in the first book, the main character's name is Winter. Ross Winter is named after my stepdaughter, Winter with a Y. And in the first book, she has left a cult on the American prairie in Iowa, traveled across Nebraska to Colorado after having, she becomes instrumental in chasing down a vaccine. And the beginning of this book takes up, this is not a spoiler because it's on the book jacket. The beginning of this book takes up when she and her friends have gone into an underground silo, which we do have here in Nebraska, these Minuteman silos that are decommissioned, and some people have even turned them into homes. So she and several other people have taken refuge for a time period while they're waiting for the effects and the vaccine to go into effect. And so that's where we begin, is inside this silo in what is supposed to be a 6-month stint.
Okay.
So here we start. Day 14. I miss ice cream, the way it melts into a soupy mess if you draw out the enjoyment of eating it too long, that it has to be savored in a rush. I miss the internet, my cell phone, and Netflix. I was halfway through the first season of Stranger Things when the lights went out. Oh, there was also a national blackout in the US. I miss the sky, the feel of wind, even when it carries the perfume of a neighboring pasture, the smell of coming rain. But even fresh air is a small price to pay to be sane and alive, to be with the people you love. The ones who are left anyway. My 5-year-old niece, Julie, my mom's former best friend, Julie, and her 16-year-old daughter, Lauren, and Chase, my boyfriend, who has made it his mission to keep me safe since we met 3 weeks ago. We're 5 of the lucky 63 who have taken shelter from the flu-borne pandemic in an underground silo west of Gurley, Nebraska. I used to hate that word, lucky, but there's no better way to describe the fortune of food and water. Amenities like heat, clothing, and a bed, not to mention an infirmary, gymnasium, library, hydroponic garden, laying hens, and the company of uninfected others, all safe and living in relative comfort due to the foresight of a doomsday prepper named Noah, who thought of everything, including the pixelated walls and ceiling of the upper lounge, aglow with a virtual meadowscape of billowing grasses and lazy bees beneath an artificial sky. We spent the first 4 days confined to 2 of the silo's dorm levels, with the rest of the last-minute arrivals waiting to confirm the rapid tests administered upon our arrival, mourning the loss of Julie's husband and Lauren's father, Ken, and my sister, Jacqueline, Julie's mother, stiffening at any hint of a cough across the communal bunk room, fully aware that there is no fleeing whatever we may have brought with us. The silo door is on a time lock, sealed for 6 months, by which time the grid will be back up and the disease causing fatal madness in its patients should have died out with the flu season, along with most of its victims. Those are just the opening paragraphs.
That was drew me in, and when I read it, the one thing that I should say there is there was a documentary about Ukraine recently, and they had a young paramedic nurse who was in the front line and totally exhausted, and she said, all I want to do is go back, talk to my mum, and watch Netflix. And you conjured up that kind of thing there of the things that we miss, and this is this community that's underground, and then above we don't know what's there, but presumably there's this sort of dystopian world. I'd like to take you through a few things there and how you sort of imagine them for your books. The religiously themed element of the books, where does that come from?
Well, for these 2 books, with Winter having grown up in a doomsday cult in Iowa, an enclosed community that she leaves, she's actually, she's kicked out of it and excommunicated. And so the premise of the first book is that she has to start over in the outside secular world, which she's been taught to regard as evil. I've always been fascinated with cults. And I wasn't sure if that was just me, but I've come to learn that lots of people are fascinated with cults, whether, it's something like Jonestown, whether it's more recently on the news and on HBO, there's the NXIVM cult. There's a whole special that's been on, season 2 is on right now. And it's fascinating to me. And one of the most interesting things about cults, other than, the usual characteristics, people being brought in because they're searching for something, being love bombed, the presence of a charismatic central figure, the way that they're cut off from their communities, their families, their loved ones. One of the most fascinating things to me is the fact that this was said by somebody in the NXIVM documentary. Nobody says, I'm going to go join a cult. Nobody sets out to join a cult. They join a community of people with a mission that they feel they can identify with, that they feel gives them something. And then there's the slow boiling of the frog, so to speak, where things change over time. And that's how it happens. And so for me, it's really fascinating. And even though I'm done researching these books, I'm still reading up on it all the time.
But does your fascination come from personal experience, where people tried to draw you into a cult and you said no, or drew you into a cult and you had to escape?
Not like that so much. I grew up in a very religious environment and in a very religious community, and which was viewed by some people where I grew up as cult-like. And so I grew up in a very strict religious environment, a very strict church environment. So in some ways, it's kind of taking my own personal experience and taking it further and amplifying that. So a few things I could see and understand. And then, you know, some of that is just drawn out and made much worse. In the story.
I mean, in a way we've experienced here and in the States in a similar but different way is the sort of followings of our political leaders.
Yeah.
In you know the Trump cult, and we had the Boris Johnson or Brexit cult over here, or anti-Brexit cult, whichever side you're on.
Right.
Is that something that you see is more noticeable now than say 10 or 15 years ago?
I would say it's more noticeable because we have the means to notice via social media, the news, things like that. So, you know, before, without those things, we might not have such an awareness of different groups that are very stringent in their ideology. So I think with the current state of our social media, we've been able to place various groups under much more scrutiny than in the past.
Yeah, and you're not drawn to any of them at the moment. You seem to be quite
Not that I know of.
You're not going to head off to a weird island, are you?
Well, it depends on how nice the island is. It is freezing here.
So I want to ask you a question now, because I'm going to go on to pandemic and permafrost and climate change, which is all elements of your books, of the books here. But as I said in the beginning, in the BBC, we have this mantra of educating, informing, and entertaining. You're touching on some very relevant topics here, and you're a thriller writer doing commercial fiction. So what is your mantra? What are your words about what you're doing in your work?
Well, my first goal is always to entertain. Yes, I do a lot of research. I spend so much time researching, doing it full time, treating it like a job, like my father taught me when I was gearing up to write my first novel. I've spent a year and a half before doing nothing but research full time as I prepared to write one of my books. That book was Iscariot, the story of Judas Iscariot, which he's well known as the infamous disciple of Jesus Christ. So I spend a lot of time researching. Of course, I want to get truth in there. I want true information in there. We call fiction the lie that tells the truth. And so I do hope that my readers will maybe learn something new about some of the subjects included in the stories. But my first goal is always to entertain, because my thought is that if we want only to learn about certain topics, we would be reading nonfiction. But fiction readers very specifically want to be transported away from the current reality, away from this world, and into another world, even if it looks a lot like this one.
I was going to say, because what you're doing is you're taking us into another world, which is possibly more extreme than the one we're living in, but with the same issues. So on the virus and the melting permafrost, the disease, the melting permafrost, is this a climate change element you're putting in there? Is it entertainment in climate change you're giving us?
Entertainment first and foremost, but to set the setting of how this pandemic could have started, how this came about. The pandemic in my book is a prion disease. I should clarify that it's not like a disease like COVID. It's not a virus like that. It's a prion disease. Prions are what cause mad cow. It's a more extreme version. It's a fictional version in my novels. But to set the stage for that, it is indeed climate change, the melting permafrost, that set the stage for that. And I can't take the credit for coming up with that, because it was all inspired by a news article that I read around 2016 about the melting permafrost in Siberia, where a reindeer carcass had thawed. And from the permafrost, and it happened to be infected with anthrax, and it made a nearby village sick, and a young boy died. And I remember reading this and thinking, this is horrifying and fascinating. And then I continued to read and learn more about scientists being wary about what else could be in the permafrost, as far as microbes. They call them zombie microbes if they're being very dramatic. Different things that become viable when they actually thaw, and seeds that have been able to be germinated that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years. So it's fascinating, based on the news. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I noticed that as a journalist back when they said that, and have looked into it a bit, because the whole of the Arctic opening up and that northern area, and what is, the diseases that are frozen underneath, and you put that into entertaining fiction. Emma has come back on the religious thing. Emma says, are you drawn to any religious group, e.g. Christianity? I think you're very brave to write about religious fiction. Have you not been criticized for it?
That's a really good question, Emma. I have a lot of readers who identify as Christian, and so I do have a core readership who are Christian and who enjoy my novels because of that aspect. I try my best to remain true to, for stories like the story of Judas Iscariot, or for stories about the Queen of Sheba and her appearance in the Bible and various other texts. I try to remain true to those texts, and I try to remain true to history as well. I do my best. It is an extra layer of scrutiny for a fiction writer. I mean, anytime you're writing a story like this kind of story, you're under scrutiny for, writing a great story, for making it believable, for doing your research, for all those things. But when you add the religious aspect, there's a whole other layer there, because you're under scrutiny of churchgoers and people who grew up with these religious traditions, but also people who may know their church history and their scriptures very well. And so there's a lot of extra work.
And your protagonists and antagonists, good guys and bad guys in layman's language, are they religious people or non-religious people? How do you work that one out?
So I write my biblical fiction in the first person. So my second novel is a book called Hava, the Story of Eve, and it's written in first person from her point of view. That book is about to re-release in the next few months. I just received the rights back to that, so I'll be re-releasing that on my own. But also the story about Judas Iscariot, also written in first person. And so he becomes the vehicle that we're seeing the whole story through, which was a very, very scary choice for me to make. But weirdly, the following year after it came out, it won Christian Book of the Year. So,
okay.
Yeah.
You never know, do you? You never.
A book about Judas, but I tried very hard to honor everything in that story, and especially the fact that was a story about Judas Iscariot's relationship with his friend and mentor, Jesus Christ. So,
and of course, I saw Jesus Christ Superstar, the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical recently, say in the past year, and I hadn't realized then that was essentially the relationship between Jesus and Judas. That's what it was all about, wasn't it? The two men sort of, spiritually and everything competing against each other. And
absolutely. We think of them as enemies in a way, because Judas is infamous as a betrayer, but in the Bible, at least, he's the only disciple that Jesus called friend. And so they have a unique relationship. And as a fiction writer, I always believe that when you read, even when I wrote about Elizabeth Bathory, the infamous blood countess, who is a real historical person, I always believe that there's more to the story. There's always more to the life that is lived between the year of birth and the year of death. So I like exploring what that more could have been.
And to follow up on the last bit of Emma's question there, have you been criticized for it? Is there a danger in today's social media world that we've been talked about of sort of getting cancelled, so that, you're like J.K. Rowling has happened to her?
Yeah, there's a danger in getting canceled no matter what you do, especially if you are visible, if you have any work or things or social media that might be in front of other people. That's definitely a consideration. And yet here we are, and this is our world, and we still have to live our lives and do our things. And so yes, there's always that kind of fear. There's always the worry of offending people. There's always the worry of a misstep. And, you know, I do the best I can do. And
But you've said nothing so far in your early morning in Nebraska to offend me at all. I'm loving this conversation, and we are going to say we're in our second half now. Any writing tips for Tosca? Give them to her, because we're going to talk about writing tips at the end of here. And what is the worst and best she's ever had? And how did she get her name? We've had a couple of answers on that, but let's see if anybody else has got any ideas. I want to talk about and you mentioned it, the search for a vaccine, because you've got as we said, an entertaining, thrilling, beautifully written book, but you're talking about topics that have touched on us all. The vaccine, tell us about the search for the vaccine that you've got in A Single Light, and then how does that bounce off the controversy over vaccines that we've had in the UK and in the US and elsewhere?
I can say that, you know, after researching these books and writing these books and then watching a real pandemic play out within 4 months of A Single Light, the second book, releasing in 2018. So about 4 months later, COVID began. It was eerie because there were so many things that I had already written about, not because I'm a prophet, but just because I'd done the research about how these things could play out. But it was eerie to watch them play out. There were many things I got wrong. Here in the US, we had people hoarding toilet paper. So I did not see that coming. Could not have predicted that. Real life is definitely stranger than fiction. The search for a vaccine became very important. It was very interesting to watch that play out here as well. I could not have ever have predicted. I remember writing about the search for a vaccine. I remember living through the time period where we were desperately racing to find a vaccine just globally in real life. I could not have predicted how polarizing that would become, even within families, within families.
As to whether you get vaccinated or not.
Sure, I've seen this play out here in the US within families, with family members disagreeing with family members over it. It's been very interesting. As someone who loves playing out scenarios and seeing how things happen, and as a fiction author, it's been very compelling and very weird.
And do you have an anti-vaxxer character in A Single Light?
No, actually, I don't. So in A Single Light, they are still racing towards that vaccine, trying to make that happen, and there are various things potentially helping that and also potentially getting in the way of that. So if the story were to continue, and I've been asked to do that, I don't know if I will or not, but there could definitely be a situation where you have two camps when it comes to the vaccines.
And I was having a conversation yesterday about China and Xi Jinping and everything, and somebody says to me, well, the problem they've got is that their vaccine wasn't any good, and that's why they're still in lockdown. And it was quite a simple thing that sort of will shake or change the way the global, the global balance of power. So it's if that person was right, but that was just a view. And I do remember I was over in the States with a group of people, and one of them went to get their first vaccine in New York. And it was like going into a supermarket, and you could have Moderna over here and Pfizer over here and something else over here. And I said to one of the guys, it was all military, I said, how come you've got a choice? We just have to get whatever's given us. He says, well, in America, we're a democracy and people can choose. So I thought this is sort of, a wonderful statement that you get from the guy that was that was doing it. Just talk to me about dystopia, because we hear a lot, and you're doing it. You've got this in A Single Light. You've got people living in relative comfort, and there's something dystopian up there. What exactly is a dystopia?
So dystopia is it's scarily enough, it's only 1 or 2 steps beyond our current reality. And I think the last few years have really illustrated that. And it's been really interesting because when I started the first book, The Line Between, this is the first one, This won an International Book Award, but not for dystopian fiction. It won for mystery and thriller, best mystery thriller of 2020, or it won in 2020 for 2019. And but this one won an International Book Award for best dystopian in the sci-fi category. But this is really only 1 or 2 steps removed from the current reality. And it's where things have broken down and changed in ways that have been unprecedented. In the case of my stories, the power grid in the US has gone out. So that's been an extra challenge because, of course, as fiction writers, we have to make life miserable for our characters. That's our job. And I get asked often, why dystopian fiction? What is fun? We talk about the fact that we read fiction to escape the current reality and we want to take a mental vacation. Why would someone want to take a mental vacation into a world like that? And my answer is that, there's so much noise in our lives today. Our modern lives, there's so much noise, so much news, so much social media, so much email. But when you enter a dystopian situation or a dystopian simulation, which is what the fiction story is, life becomes very simple. All the noise goes away and everything gets boiled down to just one goal, and that is survival of you and the people you love. And so the goal becomes very simple and life becomes very simple in the story.
So the compelling thriller character, or as you said, we're only 2 steps away from dystopia in any of our lives, I presume, because you can have your own dystopia, can't you, is overcoming and dealing with those issues. Somebody once said to me when I was asking for writing tips, which we're going to get onto in a second, said, put your hero up a tree and never stop throwing apples at him.
Basically. Yeah, that's
I want to talk, in fact, we've got Emma's come back again and I'll ask you her question. Then I want to talk to you about The Long March Home, because that's a branch out of your career. But Emma says, how is it that a book projected for 6 years and yet the same book becomes a bestseller? Is this to do with timing in social political world events, or is it the publishers don't really have an internationally agreed rules on what makes a good story? Yes. I'm sure you've got something to say about that, Tosca.
That's a great question. Every publisher is searching for the next bestseller. So anytime you look at a bestseller, J.K. Rowling, for instance, was rejected many times before she finally sold her series, which means that many editors and publishers are kicking themselves still to this day. So, the publishers want to have those bestsellers. Can they predict them? Well, obviously not all of them can. Sometimes it does have to do with timing. Sometimes it does have to do also with, hey, look, we've already got this many dystopian novels, or we've already got this many authors kind of like this. We're full for now. Sometimes it's timing as well. My first novel, it's called Demon, a memoir. It's the story of a fallen angel telling his story. It's not a memoir, it's a novel, but that's what it's called. It was published by an inspirational religious publisher, a Christian publisher. And it took time for that publisher to be at the point where they were ready to take on an experimental story like that might have been, even the title is scary to some people. I've had people say that to me for years. It's been 15 years since that book was put out. So I think it does have to do with timing.
And is Demon Memoir, is that the Judas Jesus relationship book?
No, that is the story of a fallen angel. And so after that came Hava, the story of Eve, and then Iscariot, which is the Judas Jesus book.
Iscariot, okay.
And then the Legend of Sheba, which is the Queen of Sheba one. And then my thrillers come after that. So
because Patrick has come in and saying that the book about Jesus is on my reading list. So that's the Iscariot book. And he says, is your name Tosca because your parents enjoyed a holiday in Italy, Tuscany? We will find out, but not yet. Just tell us about the Long March Home, because you sort of branched out, you co-authored a book with somebody you had never met. And it's about a group, and I've read it, and it's absolutely fantastic. So about a group of young American soldiers that survived the Japanese invasion in the Philippines, December 41. So a few people, and I'd forgotten, Japan struck the Philippines just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. Tell us briefly about The Long March Home and when's it coming out?
The Long March Home is the story of three teenage, actually, they're 18 and 19, three, and one who's younger who had to lie about his age to join the military. Three teenage best friends from Alabama, from the South here, who enlist in the Army before Pearl Harbor happens, and they are stationed in the Philippines and are there when the strike on Pearl Harbor happens, which of course launched the US and its allies into World War II. And as Humphrey said, within hours, the Philippines was struck. The airfields were all bombed, and the boys are launched into months of war. And it's a terrible war that culminates in the Bataan Death March. And this is a chapter of World War II history I was not aware of. And so when my co-author, Marcus Brotherton, who's best known for his World War II biographies, approached me and said, hey, I've got this manuscript. I feel like it needs more. He's best known for his nonfiction. I'm best known for fiction. He said, would you like to come on board and work on this with me? This was definitely out of my normal wheelhouse because I've never done anything, historically speaking, that's this recent as far as history goes, which actually made it more scary to me instead of less. But I came on, and I'm really, really glad that I did, because I feel like it's a chapter of history that needs to have more attention there in the Pacific Theater. So it's the story of these boys and their fight to survive the war, the Bataan Death March, and their years as prisoners of war there in the Philippines. And it comes out May 2nd of next year.
May 2nd. Yes, May 2nd. And tell us about your links to the Indo-Pacific, they call us now, to Northeast Asia.
Well, my main links are that I'm half Korean. So I'm hoping that the next time I get over to see my family, half my family is in Korea, South Korea, that I'll be able to tromp around through some of the places where some of these historic battles in the Philippines took place. So, and I did just meet my co-author, as you mentioned, last month for the first time in person. So that's an interesting experience, having written a book without ever having met until then.
Now, our wonderful audience has been totally silent on your best and worst writing tips. So could you reveal to us, we're not going to reveal your name provenance yet, but could you reveal to us what is the best and the worst writing tips you've had?
Well, I'd say the worst one is a very conventional one, and that is to write what you know. If I did that, gosh, I would never have written any of the books I've written. I used to joke when I was traveling for a living, if I wrote what I knew, I'd be writing about the best place to get a burger at Chicago O'Hare Airport in the US, because I spent so much time there when I was traveling for my job. So that would be the worst one, to write what you know. The best.
Why do they say that?
I think it's because things become so familiar to you, and you can weigh in with a certain level of knowledge and familiarity. And I think that's great. You know, if I were to write about the ballet world, I might be able to write about it in a way that someone who's had to research it might not. But gosh, you know, I literally would not have written any of the books I've written had I adhered to that.
No, I mean, I generally go on the thing that if I'm researching something that I don't know and it interests me, there's a chance that it could interest my readers too. Whereas if I just write about sitting at my desk doing my emails, I don't think. And what is the best writing tip that you can give anybody who's listening who might be writing or wants to write a book?
Well, I have two. The first is one that I teach in all my writing classes, and it's my number one rule of writing, and that is to write as though no one will ever read it. And the reason I say that, even if your goal is to become published, is because it takes away the pressure of you thinking about who all these other people back here, you know, what they'll think. You just take all that away and you write as though you're writing with a flashlight under the covers with your favorite notebook, the way I used to read my books growing up. But the other piece of great advice comes from my husband, and it's when I've been in kind of my slumps, because, this career, as you know, Humphrey, is up and down, and there are times that you feel a little beaten down by it. And that comes from my husband, and he said, have fun and find the fun, because when you are having fun and are in the flow as a writer, and then you're producing good stuff that your readers are also going to enjoy. And, this is very hard work, writing novels. And if you can't have fun, it's probably not worth doing. So,
particularly since the limousines and the helicopters and the champagne have all been curtailed.
Right? Yes. It's been a while since the helicopter ride, so come on.
Now, Tosca, I want you to wait there whilst I tell our wonderful audience what is coming up, and then we're going to find out the provenance of your name and a couple of other things. Tomorrow, I am with Maggie Piggott, the wonderful Maggie Piggott, and her book is How to Age Joyfully. That's how can we all have a good time, as Tosca was saying, and maybe do that inevitable thing of getting a little older. Wednesday, the 23rd, Lucinda is with Author to Author, and that's in the evening at 6:30 with the great Adele Parks, a multi-million selling novelist whose latest one Last Secret, is about power, sex, money, and revenge. I love that. That just sort of sums up a great story, doesn't it? Lucinda, the next day, is Inside Story with Sue Teddern, second novel, The Pre-Loved Club. It's set in Brighton and tells the story of two single parents, both trying to move on with their lives after rejection by their exes. Warm, wry, and funny, say the critics. Friday, November the 25th, Lucinda is with the Goldster Book of the Month, which is a debut novel by a former pop star turned clergyman. Where do we get these people from? The Reverend Richard Coles. He's penned a cozy crime novel called Murder Before Evensong. I can imagine that now, even on the screens. A witty look at life in the Paris of Champton, where the church is run by a long-suffering canon who lives with his widowed mother and a pair of dachshunds. Yes, and while we're on Book of the Month, our New Year's Eve special, this is from a suggestion from a member, is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. And it came from a discussion amongst us all on how to coax a 16-year-old into reading books. So we thought, read the book, watch the film with Audrey Hepburn, and come to our end of year conversation. That's on New Year's Eve. I've jumped a bit there, but since I'm doing it and I've got the book here, I thought I would mention it. And how do you get a 16-year-old to read, Tosca?
I've gone through this with my children, and I think that if you find that teenagers don't love reading, they probably haven't found the right book for them yet. But also the reading may happen in different formats. It may be a graphic novel these days. It may not be a straight out novel like we're used to, like we grew up with, but I think we keep an open mind and we try different kinds of books with different kinds of subjects and stories.
Yeah, is there, because you do these wonderful library tours around Nebraska, what is the sort of youth reading feedback you get from there?
There are readers who are young who absolutely just love and adore reading. And then there are readers who are young who have come into it recently. And then there are others that they're not doing a lot of it. They're definitely reading, but they're reading things on social media or online or whatnot. So they may not be reading traditionally. And I think we have to allow a little bit of room for that, because our reading lives have definitely changed in the last couple decades.
And our attention span, of course, because when I read a Kindle now, it always tells me how many minutes I've got till the end of the chapter. So you know whether to fix that email before or after finishing the chapter.
That's true. That's true.
We are almost out of time. In fact, we are out of time, and it has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for getting up early, and thanks for being with us for so long. This is the book that we're talking about, the dystopian thriller world. One last question. Adele Parks, we talk about sex, power, money, and revenge. Are they the ingredients of a thriller? I mean, do you need them, or are there other things that we need?
Well, they're definitely great ingredients for a thriller: sex, power, money, and revenge. There's always something there. I think the main ingredient is always knowing what your main character wants, and your main character always wants something, whether it's one of those things or something else.
what the main character wants. That's a great note to finish on. And Time's winged chariot is upon us. Ah, wait a minute, Emma's back again. Are you going to publish the Stonehenge sometime in the future?
No.
Your first book.
That book is in the basement with my skeletons, and it is bad. You know, the only way to learn how to write a novel is to write one. So, but that may not be a good one off the bat. So, oh no.
Oh well,
I fear
that's
not.
a shame. That's it. It stays there. There you go, Emma. You've got your very interesting guest. Thank you, says Jean Joyce. And thank you, Tosca, for from our farming writer in Nebraska. We're going to call you. And thank you, those who contributed towards our guest. We haven't said the provenance of your name yet.
Ah,
Oh my
well,
goodness,
here it is.
quickly. Yes.
Yes, I was supposed to be a boy. I was going to be a David. And when I was born, surprise. So my father, who loved Maria Callas all of his life and loved her when she sang the part of Tosca in Puccini's well-known famous opera, named me Tosca. So there it is.
So it is from the opera. A couple of our people got it. It's not.
And it does mean from Tuscany, though I am not.
And you were meant to be a boy. How many people have fallen into that trap, as we should say?
It is true.
Until tomorrow, I'm going to be learning how to age. I didn't ask you that, but we haven't got time now. How to age joyfully. Everybody, stay curious, stay reading, stay safe. Read Tosca Lee, and of course, stay Goldster. Thanks, Tosca, for being such a good sport with us, and you can go back to sleep now. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.